At 9:14 in the morning, 50 contacts appear on the radar screens of USS Abraham Lincoln at the exact same moment. Not missiles. Not drones. Boats. Small Iranian fast attack boats spreading across a 270-degree arc, approaching from nearly every direction at once at 60 knots. They are already inside 8 miles before the radar fully identifies them because the boats have been running dark for 14 minutes, without active electronics, after launching from 11 separate hidden positions along the Iranian coastline. All 50 cross the 8-mile detection threshold within 22 seconds of each other. Not random timing. Calculated timing. An attack designed around one idea: a threat arriving simultaneously from every direction leaves no single angle to defend and no simple solution before impact. 8 miles. 8 minutes. USS Abraham Lincoln has defeated missile attacks from 19 miles away. It has intercepted ballistic threats thousands of feet above the ocean. It has survived torpedoes launched beneath its own hull. But every threat the carrier had ever faced came from a direction. From a distance. From a geometry that allowed the strike group time to build a response. 50 boats approaching at 60 knots from a 270-degree spread give the formation almost no geometry at all. The fire control systems aboard the carrier group were built to engage threats from a bearing. This threat has every bearing at once. Iran spent 11 days calculating that 8 minutes would not be enough. Chief Petty Officer James Osei had already been below the waterline since 8 o'clock that morning. Something in the passive acoustic picture earlier that day had produced a specific unease in a man who had spent 14 years studying what could destroy the hull of USS Abraham Lincoln. For more than 90 minutes he walked the forward hull sections, frame 14 through frame 31, inspecting welds, fittings, structural plates, every section closest to the approach vector he feared most. When the combat alarm sounded at 9:14, he did not move toward an evacuation ladder. He opened the flooding console on frame 19. And he started calculating. Because one number had lived in his head for years. The number separating damage from catastrophe. Iranian engineers had calculated it from one side of the problem. James Osei had calculated it from the other. And both sides had reached the same conclusion independently. 11 simultaneous contact detonations within the same hull section inside a 4-second window against frames 14 through 31 at the carrier's current draft. That was the threshold. That was the point where flooding would exceed pump capacity. The point where damage control teams could no longer isolate the breach fast enough. The difference between a ship surviving the night and a ship dying in the water. Iran had 50 boats. Osei had a flooding console and 7 minutes. He began deliberate flooding at 9:14 in 22 seconds. Not because success was guaranteed. Because if he was right about what was coming, every second mattered. And if he was wrong, the carrier would spend the next half hour carrying hundreds of unnecessary tons of seawater, and nobody would ever know why he had done it. He was not wrong. The combat air patrol jets were already turning toward the incoming swarm at 9:14. For aircraft split into northern and southern sectors, accelerating toward the densest contact clusters before their turns were even complete. The radar picture showed 50 contacts spread across a 270-degree arc. Not a wall of threats from one direction. A closing ring. The carrier strike group trapped at the center of a circle shrinking at 60 knots. The first missile left the northern patrol jet at 9:15 and destroyed a contact at just over 7 miles. A boat that had pushed ahead of the others by running its engines beyond safe limits, desperate to become the first vessel to reach the hull. Seconds later another missile destroyed a second contact. 2 boats gone. 48 still closing. The jets continued working through the outer contacts, each attack run destroying 1 or 2 boats at a time. But every turn required precious seconds before the pilots could engage again. The boats never slowed. They never changed heading. Each vessel remained locked onto its assigned approach vector toward USS Abraham Lincoln. 46 boats. Then 44. The formation was killing targets, but the ring kept getting smaller exactly the way Iranian planners had calculated. At 9:17 the escort destroyers opened fire. Rapid-fire naval guns swept across assigned sectors simultaneously, targeting the closest attack groups approaching from each bearing. Boat contacts began disappearing from radar in clusters. 38. 35. 33 boats remaining at 3 miles with only minutes left. The strike group was now destroying targets faster than at any point in the engagement. Jets attacked outer contacts. Destroyers swept through middle sectors. Every defensive system in the formation was firing at something. And still the numbers were not dropping fast enough. Not because the defense was failing. Because 50 boats approaching at 60 knots from every direction had been mathematically designed to overwhelm an 8-minute response window regardless of how well the formation performed. Iran had already done the arithmetic. At 9:18 the helicopters joined the fight. 2 helicopters already airborne from routine patrol accelerated toward the nearest contact clusters at maximum speed. Each attack pass destroyed multiple boats at once. The contact count started falling faster now. 29. 26. 24. At 9:19 the close-in weapon system activated as the leading contacts crossed the final defensive threshold. The automated gun locked onto the nearest boat and opened fire within barely a second. One contact disappeared. Then another. The system cycled again and again, destroying boats almost continuously as they raced toward the carrier. 22 boats remaining. Then 21. The fighter jets made their final attack runs before fuel limits forced them to withdraw from the combat zone. They departed with empty weapon stations while the radar picture still showed 20 contacts inside 1 mile. The number was still far above the threshold James Osei had been thinking about since the alarm first sounded. 20 contacts remained inside 1 mile. The close-in weapon system continued firing as fast as the barrel assembly could rotate, acquire, and fire again. Each burst bought less than a second. One more contact vanished from radar. Then another. 18 boats. Then 17. The escort destroyers were now firing at targets dangerously close to USS Abraham Lincoln itself, engaging boats that had already crossed into the carrier's immediate defense zone. The helicopters expended the last of their ammunition attacking the tightest clusters closest to the hull. 17 boats. 48 seconds remaining. Every available asset in the strike group was already firing at something. The jets were gone. The helicopters were nearly dry. The destroyers were approaching unsafe firing geometry relative to the carrier itself. And still the boats kept coming. 16. 15. 14 contacts at half a mile. The close-in gun continued cycling without pause, acquiring and destroying targets one after another. But the numbers were no longer working in the defenders' favor. 14 boats. 30 seconds. The gun theoretically needed just over 11 seconds to destroy 14 targets under perfect conditions. These were not perfect conditions. The boats were now so close that the radar returns from their bow waves began interfering with target tracking. 13 boats. 24 seconds. 12 boats. 18 seconds. 11 boats. 12 seconds remaining. The close-in gun destroyed another contact at point-blank range. 10 boats remained inside the final engagement zone. Rear Admiral Carver activated the all-hands circuit. All hands brace for impact. Below the waterline, James Osei sealed the flooding console exactly 7 minutes and 32 seconds after opening it. The forward trim compartments had taken on 847 tons of seawater. Not battle damage. Deliberate flooding. The bow of USS Abraham Lincoln had dropped nearly 2 degrees lower into the water. The exact hull section Iranian engineers had calculated as the ideal impact geometry had now shifted more than 2 meters below the planned strike point. Below the draft line. Below where the contact charges had been designed to hit. At 9:20 and 3 seconds the remaining boats struck the hull. For detonations hit the section Iran originally intended. But the geometry had changed. The hull plating was now lower than expected, forcing the explosive energy to spread across a wider surface instead of concentrating at the structural stress intersection. Real breaches formed. Water entered through multiple sections simultaneously. But the catastrophic structural failure Iranian planners had designed the attack around never occurred. 6 additional boats struck sections that had shifted fully below the original impact geometry. The explosions transmitted violent shockwaves through the hull, through every frame and compartment aboard the ship. The entire carrier shuddered from 10 simultaneous impacts. Lights failed in multiple compartments. Equipment systems shut down across the ship. Automatic fire suppression systems activated from the structural shock alone. The carrier's speed dropped from 28 knots to 19 as propulsion safety systems reduced power automatically. 19 crew members were injured across the vessel. 3 seriously. But the ship was still alive. Water poured through 4 active hull breaches while damage control teams moved toward pre-staged containment points James Osei had prepared before the first boat ever reached the carrier. He had positioned teams at the most likely breach locations while more than 30 boats were still alive on radar. While the fighter jets were still attacking outer contacts. While the situation still looked survivable without direct impact. Because 14 years studying the ship's vulnerabilities had produced a man who prepared for what he calculated would happen, not for what he hoped would happen. The Frame 14 breach was isolated first. Then Frame 19. Then Frame 22 after crews struggled against flooding rates that reached nearly 200 liters per second. Finally Frame 26. 28 minutes after the first hull impact, the final breach was sealed and flooding across all affected compartments came under control. USS Abraham Lincoln listed slightly to port under the combined weight of battle flooding and the deliberate ballast Osei had ordered into the ship. Pumps began clearing the forward trim compartments section by section. The bow slowly rose back toward level trim. Propulsion systems recovered. Electrical systems came back online compartment by compartment as repair crews restored damaged equipment. By 9:43 the carrier strike group was fully operational again. Meanwhile, the Iranian fast boat coordination facility responsible for launching the swarm attack had remained under continuous surveillance since the moment the first radar contacts appeared. The launch positions across the Iranian coastline had been tracked throughout the engagement. At exactly 9:20 and 3 seconds, the same moment the remaining boats struck the hull, 16 cruise missiles were launched against the Iranian command and support complex coordinating the operation. The facility ceased to exist at 10:07. Iran launched 50 boats. The strike group destroyed 40 before they reached the carrier. 10 made contact. Iranian planners had correctly calculated that 11 simultaneous detonations against the carrier's original draft geometry would produce catastrophic structural failure. They were correct about the numbers. Correct about the section. Correct about the geometry. But the hull was no longer where it had been when the attack began. At 9:43, while repair crews continued reinforcing isolation patches deep below the waterline, James Osei was still moving through the damaged hull sections by hand, checking every seal himself to make sure the carrier would survive the night.